Okay. So my study today is on Hagar, and it was because I know we always read about Abraham and Sarah, and Hagar is kind of an add-on. And it was one of those studies that Deb and I call one full of rabbit holes, because something that I thought was just going to be very straightforward and quick and easy just started unveiling more and more depths to it, which I really found exciting, and I'm hoping to share that excitement with you. So first of all, we'll quickly do a quick summary. Hagar's only really mentioned in 2 chapters in Genesis, chapter 16 and 21, and she's identified as Sarah's Egyptian maid. She is silent the whole time. The first time she speaks is when she is in the desert, but she's silent the whole time, and especially when Sarah gives her to Abraham as a wife. So because she is an Egyptian maid, she has to just do whatever's asked of her. She now gets pregnant with ease, and once she's pregnant, she must have known something that was happening in the background, that there was some form of pressure, especially on Sarah, and she became arrogant, or as the Bible says, Sarah was slut in her eyes. And Hagar realized that a promise that God had made to Abraham could possibly be fulfilled through her. So someone that was just a maid, a servant in a household, that was not special for anyone, no special relationships or anything, suddenly became very important. So now she has this arrogant attitude towards Sarah, and Sarah goes and does a total flip and goes and complains to Abraham and starts the blame game. May the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid to your embrace, but when she saw she had conceived, then I was slut in her eyes. May the Lord judge between you and me. Can you just imagine Abraham's confusion? Because first of all, it was his wife that brought this woman to him, and now she blames him for the woman getting pregnant. The words translated as the wrong done to me is better translated as the outrage that has done to me is your responsibility. While Sarah and Abraham argue, so this is also the first time we hear of tension coming up in the household, Hagar starts realizing she is only an instrument in her master's lives. She is absolutely at the mercy of the whims of both Sarah or Abraham. So now Abraham responds in a very interesting way, and we're going to look at this a bit more. He says to Sarah, he abandons Hagar, showing he had absolutely zero emotional attachment to her. And he just says, well, your servant's in your hands. Do with her whatever you think is best. Okay. Ding. So Sarah is now super irritated, super frustrated. So what does she do? She afflicts her. It doesn't record what kind of affliction took place, whether it was verbal or physical. But what we do know, it was bad enough for Hagar to flee from Sarah into the wilderness. And she chooses certain death over Sarah's abuse. So we can understand that it must have been quite severe. So she flees into this desert, and she's on her way to Egypt, and she stops at a spring along the border of Canaan. And there an angel of the Lord comes to her and says, Hagar, where have you come from, and where are you going? Interesting question, and something we're also going to look at a little bit more. And for the first time, Hagar now speaks, and her first words are, I am running away from my mistress, Sarah. And instead of giving her empathy and consolation, the angel just has a message, and he says, return to your mistress, submit to her. These are pretty harsh commands, considering that she had actually chosen death over being in the presence of her mistress. But then the angel carries on, and he gives her promises, and he says to her, I will increase your descendants so that they will be too numerous to count. So she now gets the promise of a blessing through her seed, through her descendant. And then she also gets this birth announcement. So she knew she was pregnant, but she's now told she's going to give birth to a son, and that she is to call him Ishmael. And Ishmael means heard. And the angel actually clarifies that, because he said, God has heard your cry. And unlike Abraham, who simply just did what God had commanded without comment, in previous, especially in chapter 15, Hagar now bursts forth with a cry of joy and praise, and she calls the name of the Lord who had spoken to her, saying, you are the God of seeing. And Hagar says, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? We're going to see that this comes up a lot in Genesis 15 up to 21, this play on words of seeing and hearing. And I think it's really important, especially in the story of Hagar. So Hagar bears Abraham a son, and Abraham names him, not Hagar. Abraham names him. So it meant Hagar must have gone to Abraham and said to him, you know, this boy in my stomach is going to be called Ishmael. So Abraham names him, making him a legitimate son. And Sarah is absent. You do not hear of her. She's nowhere to be found. Then in chapter 17, we read that God changes Abraham, his name, from Abraham to Abraham, and Sarai to Sarah. And he repeats the covenant that he made with Abraham in chapter 15, about him having as many seeds. His seed is going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And he institutes circumcision. Now only the promise is made that Sarah is going to get the son through whom Abraham is going to have so many descendants. Not prior to this, which I found very interesting. I hadn't realized that before. And she only has her son 14 when Ishmael is 14 years old. So you can imagine this has been 14 years of a very tense household. So when Isaac is born at his weaning celebration, Sarah watches Ishmael with Isaac. And then she comes to Abraham again and she says to him, cast out that slave woman and her son. The word cast out could be construed as a statement of divorce. She wants them gone. And this is going to come back to that other thing that we shared just now, statement we shared where Abraham gives the Egyptian Hagar back into Sarah's hand. And you'll see why it's so important that Sarah has to ask Abraham to do the divorce. If Hagar and Ishmael now go into the desert, this again is a death sentence, because there is, like Akita Deb, who's been to Israel, and I'm sure a few others would know that water at this stage and in that wilderness was few and very, very, very limited. Now we read where previously when Sarah had made that demand on Abraham to send Hagar into the wilderness, and Abraham had just given Hagar to her. This is the first time it records that he is actually greatly distressed and very pleased with her requests. And now we realize it's not, he was felt like this, not because of Hagar, but because it involved his son. Remember, his son is now 14 years old. So he would have developed a relationship with this young boy over these past 14 years. It actually means that he needs God's support and encouragement, and God supports Sarah's plan this time and tells Abraham not to be troubled, but that his promise to Hagar will be fulfilled. So Abraham is obedient as always. Whenever you hear Abraham getting a command, what does he do? He gets up early the next morning and he provides supplies for Hagar and her son, a lot different to the previous scenario when Hagar was chased into the wilderness. But Hagar can only take what she can carry, and water was a major priority, and she gets a skin of water, which is about 13.5 liters of water. You can imagine little Ishmael's surprise and not understanding quite what is happening in this whole scenario, but children are very clever and they can feel tension as well. So he must have realized something was not quite right. And now they go wandering into the desert of Beersheba again, but this time they move towards northern Arabia, where prior to this she had actually fled once in the direction of Egypt. Ding. Not long, 13.5 liters is not going to last you very long. So not long after, the water runs out, and again the threat of death looms. And Hagar just takes her son and she places him under a bush, because she's still caring for him as a mother does, because she wants him to rather die in the shade. And she moves away, so she's not going to be tormented by his lost sighs, but she stays close enough, and he's now weeping freely by herself and emphasizing her loneliness and isolation. And we pick up from this that she'd actually, in her this very traumatic moment, forgotten how God had provided previously for her. And one can imagine she was feeling totally alone here. And this time we hear again, you see the words coming in, God hears, and he calls out to Hagar. And then what does he do? He opens her eyes and she sees a well, which she had not noticed prior to this. And God was on the boy's side. He lived out, the promises were fulfilled. He lived in the desert. He became a skilled archer. Hagar got him a wife from Egypt. So what we can deduce from this is, even though she had known this God, called him the God who sees me, she had not totally converted to a faith in God, because she went back to Egypt to get him a wife. And that's kind of the end of the story of Hagar, but we read these little parts in the rest of scripture, and especially in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, where you read about the Hagarites that war against Saul. So quite a few firsts that we have picked up with Hagar now that we've looked at this summary. She is the first servant mentioned in the Bible who suffers. She is also the only person where it is recorded who names the Lord. There is no other place where it says that someone actually gives God a name. And she is the first person to be visited by an angel, and she's the first person to be given a birth announcement. And she calls God El Roy. If Stace can ping for me. She calls him El Roy, which means the God who sees me. So as I said, in these chapters, it's important possibly to keep looking at the play of these words, seeing and hearing. To me, there's a difference between seeing and looking. And I was asking Liesel her understanding and the definition, what she understood under the difference between seeing and looking. But to look at something just means to gaze at it, put your eyes over it, and to acknowledge its presence. But to see means you're not just looking at the object, but you actually understand it and you're paying attention to it. So when Hagar says and calls God El Roy, she's actually saying, regardless of what other people may call you, for me, you are a God of seeing. You saw me in my distress and you came to my aid. Ishmael's name is heard, and God, you hear Hagar also says, God has heard my cry and God hears me. So it's a constant reminder of God's presence. And it would also have been a constant reminder in Abraham's household, because they would have been calling Ishmael from 0 to 14 years. And while they're calling Ishmael, they would have understood the word God hears, God hears, God has heard, God hears, which we wouldn't pick up with the English language, but the Jewish, with them understanding, with them it being in Hebrew, they would have had this reminder the whole time. And then we also read in chapter 17, when God comes to announce, says to Sarah that in a year's time, you're going to give birth to a son, and she laughs. He hears Sarah's disbelief. you'll actually pick up quite a few more. I just kind of picked a few here and there this time. We're now going to have a look at other contrasts as well, and then we're going to look into deeper spiritual significance. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 2 to 4, Abraham says to God, you know, you made this covenant with me, but that I'm going to have many descendants, but look at me, I'm almost, I'm hitting like 100, and I still don't have any descendants. So maybe we should make my servant, Eliezer, be my heir. And God gives him a very emphatic no. In the very next chapter, chapter 16, same verses, verse 2 to 4, Abraham has sexual relationships with Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, who now falls pregnant. But even though she is actually Abraham's very own son, he does not become this heir that God had referred to in Genesis chapter 15. So there's the word servant coming through, but God gives the same answer. And I thought it was very interesting, like play on words as well as the chapters being the same there. Hagar is single, poor, she's a slave, she's very young, and she's potentially fertile. Sarah, in contrast, is the wife of a wealthy man, but she's barren, she's old, and past childbearing age, because at this stage in her life, she is already 90 years old when she gives birth to Isaac. And then another place where Hagar is referred to is in Galatians chapter 4. And we read that, if you're going to read from verse 22 to 31, we read that Hagar represents the old covenant, which is the law, and Sarah represents the new covenant, which is referring to grace. But that is a study all by itself, but also showing why it was important that Abraham, who was given the covenant with God, had these two women in his life. Genesis chapter 16 has only got 16 verses. So very, very short chapter, but unbelievably powerful. And there were three main points I wanted to pick up on. The first one was Sarah's solution. So chapter 15, God makes this promise to Abraham and makes a covenant with Abraham that he's going to have a son, and this son is going to have many descendants. And so Sarah, and then nothing happens, and Sarah realizes she's past childbearing age. So she now has her own solution, and this is rooted in unbelief, because she was impatient and she wanted this promised child, which was made to Abraham, as quickly as possible. I believe her belief became contagious because Abraham hearkened unto her voice. Was very self-centered, because in 16 verse 2 it says, God has kept me from bearing. So her want of an heir can be self-motivated. Her desire for an heir is placed against God's covenant promise to Abraham of countless heirs given in Genesis 15, because she says her reason is so that I can be built up from her, meaning Hagar. And remember how she blamed Abraham and said he was now the big problem? She has these past phrases that she utters, the Lord judge, but she should have asked God to judge before she had taken the wrong step. We read in Hebrews 11 verse 11 that she is a godly woman, but yet she still fell into the meshes of unbelief and wanting to hurry God along. When one starts moving into this dangerous realm, there's the distrust, which came dishonor. Then she confesses her wrong, but she doesn't actually suffer from it directly. Hagar, as we saw, was the real sufferer. Sarah's sin bore bitter fruit, because by her actions, she now brought strife into the household, anguish and competition. And it was the start of the rivalry which has run throughout all the ages between the Jews, which was Isaac was their father, and the Arabs, which were in the lineage of, some of them were in the lineage of Ishmael. Also very interesting to see in Genesis chapter 16 verse 1, it begins with the name of Sarai and it ends with the name of Hagar. And in this way, the two women are polarized. Sarai is shown as the subject of the verse, so she's Abraham's wife, and she's identified as the main character in this episode. And you can immediately pick up that she is symbolizing authority and domination. Hagar, on the other hand, is the object in this verse because she's just referred to as the Egyptian servant and the possession of Sarai. So she represents subservience and subordination. It emphasized that the power belongs to Sarai and powerlessness, were marked by Hagar. Very interesting how these little depths and little things just jumped out. The next thing I'd like to look at is fight or flight, which is now focusing on Hagar. So as we see, she conceives a child by Abraham, and then she goes and chides childless Sarah. And there's now jealousy between these two women, which spreads into the children, because we read that Ishmael began to tease and vex Isaac, and it led to discord between Abraham and Sarai, because Sarai now blames Abraham for the tension between Hagar and herself. You can just imagine Abraham's confusion. I think many of our husbands often have this when tables get turned on them. But this is why something I found really interesting, and why Sarai had to ask Abraham to chase Hagar away. There's a law that requires the father to grant the freedom to the slave. So when Sarai asks Abraham to do so, and he refuses by saying to her, no, I want you to do with Hagar as she saw fit, it meant that Sarai realized that Abraham was quite happy, in a sense, with the decision. So now her hands were tied. She could not get rid of Hagar legally, because that was Abraham's decision. So she just decided to do the next best thing she could think of and mistreat Hagar. And this is sad, isn't it? Because this ill treatment to Hagar by Sarah was cruel and it was irrational. And because Sarah had instigated all this wrongdoing because of her jealousy. And this is why Hagar fled. Better a flight than a fight. But it was an action forbidden to a bondwoman. She could actually be put to death if she was caught. Now the angel appears to her and tells her to return to her mistress, because even though Sarah had wronged her, she was not permitted to retaliate and do wrong herself. And I think this is where that quote, two wrongs do not make a right, come in. The only right thing to do for Hagar, as difficult as it was to return back to Sarai. But you can imagine how Hagar must have been feeling, because she was in this false position because of her master and her mistress. What decision she took. If she didn't go back, she was going to die in the desert. So a very challenging position for this young lady. So she did the right thing. She obeyed God. And knowing she wasn't just going back to a life of misery, she'd now received a promise from God. And this child was going to also be the start of a great multitude. And when I read this, I thought, why on earth did the angel make this promise to her? And the important thing is because this child was the child of Abraham. And because God had made the covenant a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 5, where he would have descendants as countless as the stars, Hagar is Abraham, Ishmael is his son, and God is showing that he's going to uphold his covenant with into a great nation as well. What was really ironic is Sarah had attempted to do something for herself through Hagar to have many, many children and fulfill this promise. But now Hagar actually gets this very same promise made to her, and the promise another part of the promise gets fulfilled through Hagar. And this shows us God always keeps his covenant, you know, and we all know through baptism, we have put on this covenant relationship with God. But here in Genesis 15, 16, and 17, it is really emphasized. He didn't plan Hagar's conception. That was part of Sarah's manipulation. Hagar wasn't even a Hebrew. She was an Egyptian slave girl. But because of the covenant in Genesis 15 that God made with Abraham, he's willing to bless any descendant of Abraham. And just look at all the blessings that did come Ishmael's way. Ishmael is blessed because God heard Abraham's request in Genesis 17:20. In 21 verse 9, Ishmael is described as a son born to Abraham, and his mother Hagar is just still referred to as the Egyptian. So never is there a honor given to Hagar or a personal relationship described there. Sarah's demand for the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael distresses Abraham because Ishmael being his son, God states that Ishmael will also become a nation because he is Abraham's offspring. And in 21 verse 17 to 18, when Hagar and Ishmael are in the desert, God hears Ishmael's cries and he saves both Hagar and Ishmael on account of his link to Abraham. So it's, you know, like this is why I said there were so many rabbit holes. You come to things and you think, wow, this is like amazing. I wonder what the significance of this is. So we've looked at Sarah's solution, we've looked at fight or flight, and then there was another play on words, a bottle and a well. So when Abraham sends Ishmael into the desert, he's 86 years old, and no, he was 86 when Ishmael was born. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So we've had these 14 years of tension between Hagar and Sarah. We've seen a relationship developing between Abraham and Ishmael, deep enough for him to be very distressed when he had to send his son into the desert. And we know there's this jealousy and pain that Sarah must have felt, hearing people calling Ishmael. God hears in the family home, but also seeing a woman that had got blessed, but not with the child and not her. So as we've seen, Hagar and Ishmael start manifesting their jealousy. Ishmael maltreats Isaac, and Sarah now tells him to cast up that servant and her child. And we've seen that Abraham was very distressed and displeased with Sarah's request because of it involving his son Ishmael. But interestingly enough, as I said, God supports Sarah's plan to actually banish Hagar into the wilderness and tells Abraham not to be worried. She again comes to a point where she's thirst-ridden, she's ready to die. She places her son under a bush. She lifts up her voice and weeps and says, "Let me not see the death of my child." She had despised Sarah. She had mocked Isaac, but she had surely not deserved such cruel treatment, especially dying from hunger and thirst in a barren land. So as we saw, and as we always see in scripture, God always seems to wait to the last minute, like total last minute, because the last drop of water is gone. Hagar has tenderly placed an almost dead boy under a bush, and now he hears the dying cry of this lad. The lad hears the wail of Hagar's broken heart, and he says, "What's the problem, Hagar?" I mean, I'm like, can't you see, God? Well, there's a big problem. But he says, "Fear not." And he opens her eyes and she sees a well of water, and she and the boy were both saved from death. So Abraham had given Hagar a bottle, a wineskin of 13.5 liters, but it soon became empty, a very temporary solution and provision. God gives Hagar a well, and the lad drank, and we then hear God was with him, and he grew and became an archer in the wilderness. He made the wilderness his home because he was provided by God. So an interesting play there as well, and what man can provide and what God can. So we're going to click on a couple of more points where I thought, let's have a look at some of the lessons we can learn from the different situations. First of all, Sarah didn't heed God's command that marriage is between one man and one woman, and she gave into the cultural trends of that time by giving her maid to her husband as a second wife so that she could get heirs. She got exactly what she wanted, but she wasn't happy. So what can we learn from this? That short-term solutions can have long-term repercussions, and always question the status quo. Make sure that it is in line with the will of God. And secondly, coming to Hagar, that when facing situations that seem overwhelming, that cause a lot of pain and hurt, just remember, God is willing to chase us down, just like he looked for Hagar when she was by the well or by the spring. And he'll wrap us up in his love when we start feeling used and we begin running scared and our thoughts don't actually, we cannot think rational thoughts. It doesn't take away the facts. And I mean, like we said, we didn't know how Hagar was abused by Sarah, but verbal assaults are often a lot more hurtful because they can alter our personalities, because it doesn't matter what we say, they do affect the way we ultimately see ourselves, and they can often make us feel worthless, unloved, and disrespected, especially if they have come from someone that we respect, someone whose opinion we feel is like very worthwhile for us to hear. In Proverbs 18 verse 10, we read, God's name is a place of protection. Good people can run there and be safe, which is a great verse for us to remember when we are facing challenging times. We often just want to flee from people, and just like what we say, we want out. We don't want to be near the people that are causing us the pain. And often when we take action, we don't actually know where we're going to. We just want to move on. But if we're not careful, we can actually run directly into similar situations. And that's why I think it's so important that the angel said to her, where are you running from and where are you running to? He needed Hagar to also understand that there's a better chance of finding a solution that will alleviate our pain and bring about results we desire when we know the answer to those two questions. We also see Sarah's need for controlling her circumstances and how sadly Hagar's attitude changed when she was finally given something of value, which also had sad repercussions. Sadly, Sarah couldn't control the one thing that was her temporary inability to have children. And this brings the lesson that often we wrestle with God about things that are beyond our control. And what we fail to realize is that God's not withholding the thing we want forever, but just till his timing is right. And we've often spoken about that at our ladies' Bible studies. Something to also bear in mind, that those of us who like to be in control the most often fail to realize that we cannot control ourselves and our emotions when things actually don't go the way we want it to. Hence Sarah's very bad reaction when Hagar flaunted her pregnancy in front of her. So a lesson we can learn from this is when things don't go with the way we want them, to blame others and to act out of anger, which are natural responses, is not going to bring a solution. They will not change the situation to become the way we want it to be. There's also no excuse for Hagar's haughty attitude towards Sarah. So, but we can see that we can kind of understand it, because you can imagine as a slave, she had nothing. and had spent most of her life being looked down upon and being ordered around by people. And now, because she's pregnant, circumstances had changed, but it didn't give her the right to be arrogant. But two things that come out of this is the possible presence of insecurity. Sarah was jealous and insecure. Hagar was arrogant and insecure. And we read in Proverbs 16, verse 9, that the mind of a man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So knowing that we cannot always blame God, but it would be good to make decisions in alignment with God's will. Why did God send Hagar back to her place of hurt, even though it wasn't going to result in a peaceful and painless resolution, restoring the relationship between Sarah and Hagar, or between Hagar and Abraham? But we know Hagar went back, but I believe it's because God sent her back with a blessing and not the sentence of misery. And God had made us understand her worth, and he wanted her to look forward to her future, but she first had to make peace with her past. That where are you coming from and where are you going to? So this courageous decision is often one that we have to make in our own lives, but know this, that it will bring you strength and freedom to face the future. And this is even more important. It can often place you in a position of ministry for others who could face similar challenges, because you will be speaking from a position of experience. Hagar now flees to the desert, and she's in this deep agony and very lonely. That's when her view of God was changed. I truly believe that she must have heard Abraham and Sarah talk about God, because she knew of God. They could have shared their hope with her and the promises and how to be faithful. But to her, he could have just been some distant figure up in the sky, not a real living, breathing God. And in the desert, she now realizes he is someone who took interest in her life, because she refers to him as the God who sees me, Ishmael, meaning God hearing. So God has moved from being the God to being her God, which is the start of a relationship, and something that I feel is very valuable in all our lives and a nice position to move to. We also learn that we can often run from our circumstances, but we can never, ever hide from God. I believe often in his love, he saves us from poor choices, because he wants us as his child to live a life that is whole and holy. Whole, so that we can face things that have hurt us and forgive others and be forgiven. And as we've also heard in a previous class, to learn to forgive ourselves, and to be holy, where we are striving to be like Christ to everyone we encounter, no matter how undeserving they may be of our love and our forgiveness. So imagine Hagar as well. Now, for 14 years, she has most probably been trying to make amends with Sarah, because you don't really hear of many disputes. But now she's sent into the desert a second time, and it's not even her fault. It's because, again, Sarah flies into a jealous rage because of Ishmael making fun of Isaac. So this poor woman always seems to suffer because of other people's actions. Abraham doesn't even take her side, because he sends her away from her home, but with their son. And this is where Hagar realizes there's no place for her or Ishmael in Abraham's family. Now, when she goes into the desert, she has nowhere to go. And this time she knows she actually can't go back, because the man of the household has divorced her. He has sent her away. And I can understand here that she even could have felt that God had left her as well. And in our lives, this is also sometimes positions I believe we find ourselves to be in, that it's hard to understand why things just seem to be going wrong. But I really would love us to all develop our relationships with God and Christ to such a level that we need to remember that God is constantly at work, putting together something good for us that will ultimately lead to his glory. And this is where this verse, Stace, is awesome in Romans 8, verse 28, where we read, all things work together for good to those who love God. Not just some things, all things work together for us who love God. So now we're coming to the end of my study, and we can see a God now who comes to Hagar. Remember, he came to her. She didn't call for him. She had actually forgotten about this God who was hearing and seeing. She'd forgotten about his promise to her because her son was dying. She put him under a bush and she didn't want to hear his last dying breaths. But God comes and he reminds her. He immediately provides a well to revive her bodies physically. And he sends the word of encouragement to revive their souls emotionally and spiritually sustaining them. So again, Hagar couldn't see the spring. God has to reveal it to her by opening her eyes. And this is a position I guess we can also often be in our spiritual lives, because sometimes distance builds up in our relationship with God. And it can only be because we have left him. So to find him, we often just need to call him again. And I truly believe God will come to our rescue. We read in Jeremiah 33, verse 3, call to me and I will answer you. I will tell you great and mighty things which you do not know. So the very answers to our desperate cries are often right in front of us, if only we would notice them. Too often, could you open the whole slide, please, Stacia? Too often things in our lives tend to distract us from seeing God at work in our lives. Our busyness, too many chores, too many responsibilities, and we're looking at that and focusing on that instead of seeing God working at our lives. And I love this verse in Joshua chapter 1, where God says to Joshua, have I not commanded you to be strong and courageous, to not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. He wants us to be strong, have strength, and have courage. So what have we seen? We've seen in the life and experience of Hagar that temptations can come when we are moved to new positions. There's foolishness to take hasty action in times of trial and difficulty. That there's care exercised over the lonely by an all-seeing God. There's a divine purpose in the life of everyone, however obscure and friendless. God will work out his gracious purposes by even seemingly harsh methods. Now Hagar was sent back to Sarah. And there is always strength, comfort, and encouragement that accompanies the hardest experiences of his children. God does not promise us a life of a bed of roses, as we say, when you become his child. I think Psalm 139 also sums it up beautifully, where it says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. So in our lives, we are going to have people who challenge us. We're going to have Sarahs who love us when they want to use us for something and then can't stand us when we have something they don't. We're going to have Abrahams who wish us well, but don't have the courage to stand up for us when the moment arises. We're going to have Isaacs who are favored people to whom we will never quite be able to live up to. And you know, it doesn't matter. because what matters most is that we have God in our lives and that he is on our side. He is always there. More often, as we have said, God will not take away our circumstances, but he actually comes into it with us. He calls us to face a situation for what it is, but does not demand that we do it alone. He sees us, and this gives us the confidence we need to face the circumstances at hand. We are not left alone to suffer. So in closing, I'll give the prayer where we say, Dear Father, I praise and thank you for being a God who sees and hears. I thank you for opening your arms to welcome me, be it in times of joy or sadness. Help me to daily make a conscious effort to put my words and actions behind my faith, to trust that you are constantly at work in my life, to have the patience and the confidence to know that my faith in you will give you freedom to move in my life. I know that I often feel bad about thoughtless words, thoughts, and actions, and I need your help to let go of the shame, the guilt, and the regrets it brings into my life, and to learn from my mistakes instead of beating myself up. Please help me to grow into a strong person of faith and integrity who takes the right action steps on the road to the kingdom of our Lord Jesus. Our Lord, the kingdom will establish when he returns. May we forever bring glory to your name. Amen.